What's up, folks? Welcome back to Tactical Tortoise. My name is Trevi, and today we're going to be going through getting started with the Space Marine faction. I'm going to talk about building a Space Marine collection from the Combat Patrol level. I'm going to give a brief overview of the Space Marine faction and some basic pieces of tactical advice that you need when you're collecting your army. From there, we're going to talk about some sample lists that you can expand a Combat Patrol into Incursion and Strike Force games, some ways you can play that, and some ways you can expand that collection even further. This video is meant to be a baseline for players looking to get started in 40k with the Space Marine faction, but it's not meant to be a hard and fast rule, so if you have particular preferences or units that you would like to try out, feel free to experiment. So with that, let's talk about Space Marines in general. Space Marines, or the Adeptus Astartes, are the elite shock troopers of the Imperium. They are genetically engineered and trained from a young age, and as such are hyper-elite but very well equipped with cutting-edge military technology. On the tabletop, they tend to play relatively small and elite units. They're jacks of all trades. Most of their units are both functional in melee and at ranged, but the faction generally has an emphasis on ranged attacks, although you can build it to be strong in melee. The units in general are relatively slow, and while there are many ways to speed them up within the faction, playing around that slow speed is an important part. However, they are also fairly resilient, so they can take a little bit of punishment before going down, and oftentimes you'll find that enemies have a tough time removing every model in a unit. They also tend to have a slight focus on characters and powerful character combination. The Space Marine Army ability is called Oaths of Moment. This allows you to choose one enemy unit at the beginning of your turn that your army will be more effective against. You'll get hit rerolls, and most Space Marine chapters will also gain +1 to wound against that unit with all of their attacks. Not only their ranged attacks, but also melee attacks as well. If your opponent only gives you a few things to attack, this is great. If they have a couple light units that have moved forward to score some objectives, just using the Oath of Moment on them to kill them efficiently is very nice. But if they have come forward and given you the opportunity to attack a big, scary target, using Oath of Moment to ensure that you can get the maximum damage on that unit is crucial. It'll take you a couple games to understand what the most optimal Oath of Moment target is in any given situation. And knowing that is very important, but the benefits that it gives you are huge and allow Space Marine units to punch up way harder than you would expect them to. So with that, if you're trying to get started with Space Marines, where should you begin? Now, any player who's getting started in 40k or getting started with a brand new faction that they're trying to learn, I recommend you start with the Combat Patrol. In Warhammer 40,000, the Combat Patrol format is a small-scale style of game that plays with pre-constructed lists. Each faction has one or more Combat Patrols to select from, and while there are some enhancements and objectives that you can choose once you've picked out your Combat Patrol, you don't have to do any list construction. They give you a good baseline set of models that you can purchase all at once, and a couple Combat Patrol games will introduce you to the mechanics of 40k, as well as give you an understanding of how the units in the faction work. Now, Space Marines uniquely are broken into several sub-factions. These are called chapters and represent the different styles of Space Marine chapter that we can find in the game's lore. Many of these chapters have additional rules that you can play alongside, but today we're just going to be discussing what are called Codex-compliant chapters, or Space Marines just built out of the normal Space Marine Codex without using any of the additional supplements. In specific, we're going to be discussing the Ultramarines chapter because that's the most commonly played one out of the Codex and has the most options. But if you're interested in one of the other specific chapters, let me know down in the comment section, and I may dive into constructing specifically those chapters in future videos. Now, the reason I mention all this is that the Codex-compliant Space Marines do have a Combat Patrol kit. However, I actually don't recommend that you start there. This is the kit that's included in the 40k starter set, and unfortunately the units included inside it are kind of complex and difficult to use and don't represent a very good starting point for armies inside the Space Marine faction or even for new players who are just getting into 40k. It's very easy to mess up with units like Infernus Marines and Terminators and not really get your value out of them. Instead, I actually recommend that you start with the Dark Angels Combat Patrol. This kit will give you a good selection of Space Marine infantry. This includes 10 intercessors, 5 Hellblasters, a trio of Blade Guard veterans, as well as a Gravis captain. These units are all usable in small-scale games, and you find that you can use the contents of this Combat Patrol in most of your list builds, so that's where we're going to begin. Now, once we have this Combat Patrol assembled, I recommend we split these 10 intercessors into 2 smaller units of 5. Unless you have a specific combination in mind for using these models, like we're attaching characters that we want to apply all their buffs to, or we have stratagems that we want to use on a larger volume of models, it's best practice to keep your units in smaller units of 5 because it makes them more flexible on the tabletop and it makes it harder for enemies to do excess damage to them. So throughout our list building, we're going to be including these intercessors as 2 smaller units. I also recommend that you include special melee weapons on your sergeants. Generally speaking, power fists are the best option here. For the Gravis Captain, a power fist and a second-hand melee weapon like a relic blade or a chainsword are typically the most commonly played combinations, and that makes that guy pretty resilient and also hit fairly hard in melee. Now, once you have a couple games using the Combat Patrol under your belt, I recommend that we graduate to a Incursion level. This is 1,000 points and represents a small increase in force size over the Combat Patrol, but allows you to construct your army and play using all of the normal rules that are played in standard size games of 40k, which are using 2,000 point armies. In this case, when constructing our army, we now have to select a detachment. Detachments are collections of special abilities that governs how your army operates on the table, and typically include special bonuses like an ability your entire army will benefit from, stratagems you can use on your units, and enhancements that you can apply to your characters. In this case, I recommend that we start with the Gladius Task Force Detachment. This is a very new player-centric detachment that is designed around making your army as flexible as possible, and has a ton of stratagems and abilities that make your army operate more flexibly on the table. This includes its combat doctrines, which allows you to choose a special effect at the start of your turn, which includes things like the ability to advance and shoot, the ability to advance and charge, or fall back, shoot, and charge. Meaning that in any situation, if you ever need a specific kind of mobility amp, you have that available to you. It also has a lot of stratagems that will buff you in certain phases. For example, Storm of Fire helps you in the shooting phase, and Honor the Chapter helps you in the fight phase. You basically always have tools available for you in any situation. Now, building this Incursion list off of the Combat Patrol list, we've added a couple new units here. This includes, importantly, 2 units of Space Marine Scouts. These can be built out of the Space Marine Scout Kill Team box, which does give you a unit of 10 of them that you can split into 2 smaller units of 5, although you may have to source the special and heavy weapons separately, or just split them up between the 2 units of 5s. From there, we're going to add 5 additional Hellblasters to our Hellblaster squad. This is a little bit tougher to get because Games Workshop has repackaged Hellblasters into boxes of 10, but I believe that you can still find the old package boxes of 5, or you can convert the other 5 out of intercessors or use 3D printing to get the additional 5 of them. It's a little bit of a weird unit size that comes in the Combat Patrol. We're also then going to get some Eradicators, a unit of 3 Eradicators for our Gravis Captain to hang out with, as well as the Ultramarine special character Marneus Calgar. Now, as long as we're playing Ultramarines, Marneus Calgar is probably going to be included in essentially every army that we build. He's one of the biggest benefits that we get for playing not only Codex-compliant Space Marines, but Ultramarines in specific. He gives you additional command points to use over the course of your turn. He also hits really hard in melee and is very difficult to kill. And he can attach into our Blade Guard veterans. He gives the entire unit the ability to advance, shoot, and charge, which is good because he also has some pretty solid ranged attacks. So now we have our Incursion level army. Let's talk about using Space Marines on the battlefield. We've included units like these Scouts, which are going to operate as what are typically referred to as utility units or scoring units. Scouts have both the Infiltrate and Scouts ability, so they can begin the game up ahead of your army outside of your deployment zone. The Scouts ability also allows them to move before the game begins, so they can deploy very aggressively, and then, depending on who goes first, they can move back into a safe position, or even more aggressively, moving forward if you have first turn, or back into cover if your opponent is going first. So they can always be relatively safe while out in the open. The important thing that these guys are going to be doing, while they don't do very much damage, is just scoring your objectives. Depending on the type of mission that you're playing, you may have secondary objectives that you're able to complete, and having Scouts start up the game in the middle of the table allows you to complete those fairly well. I wouldn't try to get any damage out of these guys. I would be focused almost entirely on these guys standing in the center of the table and scoring. It's also important to make sure that your army is outside of your opponent's line of sight in the early game. If you're using a recommended terrain layout from the Pariah Nexus set, you can usually find places to hide your army, especially in the Incursion game type, fairly reasonably. For example, we have our Gravis unit standing up here in the center that's hidden behind this ruin just outside your deployment zone. The line of sight can't be traced over ruins as long as the attacker or defender aren't within them. So for example, if we were to check our line of sight, we'll notice that any line of sight that's attempting to reach the Eradicators would end up passing over one of these ruin terrain features. So these guys are very safe unless your opponent is able to get basically on this side of these terrain features, in which case you would probably simply be charging them. So areas like this give you a solid location to start your units in, but otherwise there's no real reason to keep your army out in the open in case your opponent goes first. Space Marines are not very high model count, as I mentioned before, so very often losing a couple units in the early game will mean that you struggle to come back later on. The Intercessors also have a rule called Objective Secured. This allows them to lock objectives in under your control as soon as you control them at the end of your command phase. So starting a unit of Intercessors on an objective will immediately lock it in, and you don't have to worry about holding that objective unless your opponent can reach it somehow later on in the game. So I would always start a unit of Intercessors on your home objective and any other objectives you can easily reach. From there on, the Intercessors are good for killing light units. They have a lot of bolter shots, which are going to be good at destroying small infantry units that are toughness 3 or lower, but I wouldn't expect to get too much damage out of them, similar to the Scouts. Instead, they're also going to operate as utility units and move around the table and score objectives, or screen out your opponent from bringing reserves in. Most reserve units can't arrive within 9 inches of your units, so having units that stand in the back of your deployment zone, for example, that just stand in this area, and we are on Tabletop Simulator today, so we have some really good tools to indicate what our screening looks like. Having these guys stand out in the back here prevents the opponent from coming into your deployment zone to score any secondaries or attack you from the rear. Having units like these, especially in larger games, is always useful. Now you notice as well that the Hellblasters has not started on the table. This is a unit that's fairly good at strategic reserving. You can put up to a quarter of your army in strategic reserve, and starting turn 2 onwards, they'll come off a table edge 6 inches away. So in most instances, having a couple units in strategic reserve to force your opponent to think about them is going to be useful. And given that the Hellblasters are exactly just below 25% of our army at this 1,000-point level, means that they're an excellent unit to do this. If your opponent gives you the opportunity to attack one of their big, heavy units, you can put your Oath of Moment on that unit to grant yourself rerolls and +1 to wound, and then bring in the Hellblasters from strategic reserve off of a table edge as long as you're 9 inches away from your opponent, potentially even buff them with some of your offensive stratagems like Storm of Fire, and absolutely blast them down. The Hellblasters are also good in this kind of offensive capacity because even if your opponent shoots back at them, there's a chance that the Hellblasters will then shoot when they're killed, which makes them very dangerous to deal with even on your opponent's turn. From there, our shorter range units like Marneus Calgar and the Gravis Marines will need to stage as they move up the table. Staging is an important concept for any army in 40k, but for Space Marines in general, because their movement speeds aren't phenomenally long. Essentially, it just means that we want to take a turn for them to move into an aggressive position that can threaten objectives in the center of the table, but not necessarily expose them to attack. This means that early on, we would want Marneus Calgar to advance behind this terrain feature, for example, or potentially this ruin, and in that position now start to threaten some of the objectives in the center of the table. So if our opponent moves up to take those, Marneus Calgar can use his ability to advance and charge, move up aggressively, and punch them in the face for their insolence. Ruins like this, or this one that are just outside your deployment zone, are an excellent place to set up your staging units. You don't want these guys to be attacked before they get the opportunity to shoot, but you want to punish your opponent for trying to move into the center and taking objectives. Now, once you have a couple of Incursion games under your belt, it's time to graduate to the standard game size for 40k, that being a Strike Force game. If you're going to play in tournament play, Strike Force games are the standard game size that you'll be playing, and they're the game size that the game is both balanced around and the missions are typically constructed for. This means doubling the size of our Incursion army, but generally speaking, at this points level, Ultramarines and Space Marines in general will incorporate some vehicles into their army, and that's mostly what we're adding here. In terms of infantry and characters, we have added a new character to the army, Uriel Ven. Ventress. He's another really powerful character from the Ultramarines chapter, and he gives you the ability to teleport one of your units onto the battlefield. He gives them the Deep Strike ability. This is a really good combo with units like these Hellblasters, because then, instead of coming off of a table edge, which is relatively easy for your opponent to screen, especially in the Strike Force game mode, he allows them to come in anywhere on the battlefield 9 inches away from enemies. So your opponent has a much tougher time stopping them from arriving. He's also a pretty solid combatant himself, and we've brought a new unit, a Company Heroes unit, to attach him into. The Company Heroes unit could also attach with Marnius Calgar, and these two characters could trade their attached units however they want. But the Company Heroes is just very difficult to kill and has some pretty solid ranged attacks. So Uriel Ventress is able to get up into the fight a little bit more safely. He also has a command point tax effect that can mess up enemy command point usage, which is also incredibly powerful. Moving on from there, we've also increased the size of our Eradicator squad, bringing 6 of them alongside our Captain and Gravis armor, and given the larger size of the game, and the fact that we're going to be teleporting one of these units into the fight, we could potentially put both of them in reserve if that's the way we wanted to play. Now, last but not least, we've also included a bunch of armored units. This includes 2 Ballistas Dreadnoughts, a Predator Destructor. This is a model of a Predator Annihilator, but don't tell anyone. Although you could interchange it with the Predator Annihilator, depending on what you want to be shooting at, as well as a Vindicator and a Stormspeeder Hammer Strike. The Hammer Strike is important because it gives you a lot of close-range shooting, but it also removes cover from enemies that it shoots at, which makes all of your other shooting, like Hellblasters or Ballistas Dreadnoughts, much more powerful. As long as you can set up to attack the target with the Hammer Strike first, you're going to be doing a lot more damage, since cover is very easy to achieve in 40k. The Vindicator is a difficult unit to kill. It's not invincible, because its toughness is kind of middling, but it does have a 2+ save and access to Smokescreen, so you can pay a CP to give it stealth and cover using the Smokescreen stratagem. It also shoots pretty hard into a variety of targets. Its main cannon is Blast, so it gains additional shots when targeting large enemy units, so it can fire into infantry just fine, and it's absolutely lethal to armored targets with a high AP and a high damage. The range is relatively short, but if we're using Gladius Task Force, we can allow it to advance and shoot with Devastator Doctrine, and then even further improve its damage output with Storm of Fire, potentially. Predator adds a lot of long-range shooting to our army, either with a big autocannon that's able to clear infantry, or a bunch of las cannon shots from the Annihilator version. Either of those is pretty solid and gives you a good backline unit that can sit in the back and plug away at armored targets. The Ballistas Dreadnoughts are similar. They don't shoot quite as many times as a Predator Destructor, but they do have built-in hit rerolls, so they can attack something that is not necessarily Oath of Momented at that time. As long as the unit they're attacking is not below half of its starting wounds count, then they'll get hit rerolls regardless, and while they won't get all the other benefits of attacking the Oath of Moment target, those hit rerolls will make them extremely reliable. Now with that, this army plays very similarly to the Incursion version, just with more units on the table. Even with these larger armies, it's always important to keep in mind that you very rarely want to give your opponent the opportunity to shoot you in the early game, so make sure that you pre-measure your lines of fire and ensure that your opponent can't get cheeky shots on you from where they're deployed. From there, the long-range units like the Ballistas Dreadnoughts and the Predators usually like to have a flank position where they can draw really clean lines of sight around the edges of the table and punish your opponent for moving out of their deployment zone. Our shorter range units like the Vindicator can stage in a forward position like this, and then use their tanky profile and their short-range gun to really dominate the center of the table. In this case, we put both of our ranged units into strategic reserve, one of them being teleported onto the battlefield using Uriel Ventress, and the other one just walking in off the table edge with the normal strategic reserve rolls. If we do that with the Gravis Captain's unit, one thing to keep in mind is that the Captain has a Rites of Battle effect that he can use to reduce the command point cost of stratagems. And there is a really powerful stratagem for units coming out of reserve in the core rules called Rapid Ingress that allows them to come in at the end of your opponent's turn instead of in your turn as normal. This can let you, especially for short-range units like these Eradicators, if you have space, for example, on turn 2 onwards behind a ruin in the center of the table like this, set them up in a position where your opponent doesn't have line of sight to them and can't shoot them, but then on your turn, move up into an aggressive position and actually fire with them, potentially using like Devastator Doctrine, for example, to get extra movement up the table, and then shooting their short-range guns into enemy armored vehicles that are in their deployment zone. And you can use that for free with the Captain and Gravis armor, which is pretty nice as well. Ultramarines, in general, have a very good command point economy, and you'll find many Space Marine armies do this as well. They have a lot of units like Captains that can discount the cost of their stratagems, and units like Marnius Calgar that will generate them additional command points on top of that. As much as possible, we want to be using our small utility units like scouts and intercessors to be scoring as many points as we can in the early game without having to commit our big units to the table, because Space Marines want nothing more than to be the second punch of the game. They want to force your opponent to come into the center to fight with their smaller skirmishing units and then counterpunch with their absolutely devastating shooting and close range melee units. So you want to keep those units as safe as much as you can, and then on the turn where your opponent gives you things to shoot at, attack them with their entire army and act like the shock troops that Space Marines really function as. You want to come in with your Hellblasters as well as your Gravis Armored units all together so your opponent doesn't know which one to target first, and at that point also potentially run forward with these powerful characters like Uriel Ventress and Marneus Calgar, give your opponent more to attack than they can possibly kill. If you can kill something of your opponents on your turn, force them to split their fire on their turn and maybe attack you inefficiently, then come back even harder on the subsequent turn, that's the best case scenario for a Space Marine army, and that will likely lead to victory. The army that we've constructed here is fairly effective. This is a pretty solid army that would be seen in a competitive event, although it's not necessarily the bleeding edge of competitive play, and there are a lot of options to expand it in the future. You can swap some of the foot infantry for more armored units. You can even take some more utility units if you find that you need more scoring, like Phobos units such as infiltrators or incursors. Or even as you expand, add more powerful special characters to the army like the Primarch Robute Gilliman. He can be very difficult to play, especially if you're new to the game, so I wouldn't necessarily recommend that you start right off the table by playing Gilliman, but he is also an incredibly powerful force multiplier in armies like this one that we've constructed. And with that, that is my guide on getting started with Space Marines from the Combat Patrol level all the way up through Strike Force. But let me know down in the comment section what you think of these army lists and the Space Marine chapter that you're most excited to play, as well as which army you'd like me to cover next on this series. If you enjoy my content and you want to support me, you can do so either over on Patreon at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise, becoming a YouTube channel member down in the video description, or subscribing to me over on Twitch, where I live stream all of my games of 40k on Tabletop Simulator. Or at the very least, you can drop a like on the video and subscribe to the channel in the normal YouTube way. So thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.